The way commissions work in the real estate industry has changed forever, and most of the people that I'm speaking to are actually unaware of these changes. So in this video, we're going to talk about the implications of these new regulations and how they really affect buyers and sellers when they're buying and selling a home. And towards the end, I will share my own personal thoughts on these new laws, but I do want to say if you're one of those people that likes to leave rude comments down in the comments below, please don't do that. Just go ahead and sign off now. You don't have to listen to the video. It's no problem. I'm just trying to share this information with you so it's hopefully helpful for a lot of people out there. And real quick, I just want to say that if you need help with any real estate needs here in LA or North Orange County, or you need a referral to a great agent anywhere else in the country, please reach out to me. My contact information is down below. And if that's not something you need, I have one small favor to ask you. If you wouldn't mind, please go ahead and click the like button, click the subscribe button, leave a comment down below. It means the world to me. I really appreciate it. All right, let's jump back in. So we're going to talk about first what this really means for sellers. Then we're going to talk about what it means for buyers. And then we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to what it practically looks like in the actual process of buying and selling and talk about some of those details. So the main thing that's really changed for sellers is that they're no longer able to publicly market that they're willing to cover the buyer agent's commission. So what this really means is that a seller cannot agree upfront in a listing agreement with a listing agent to cover the buyer side commission, and they can't publicly market that they're going to be willing to cover the buyer side commission either. However, they are still able to say things like we're willing to credit the buyer a certain percentage toward the buyer's costs, or things to that effect, which ultimately signal the buyer's agent that they are still willing to cover the buyer's agent commission, of course, subject to negotiation at the time of offer. Now, practically speaking, most sellers are still going to want to cover the buyer's agent commission just like they always have, for many different reasons. One reason being many buyers are not going to be able to cover the commissions on top of their down payment and their closing costs, loan costs, etc. And since the seller is ultimately the one that gets the lump sum at the close of escrow, it makes more sense oftentimes for the commissions for both sides of the transaction to come out of the money that the seller is ultimately going to receive, that the buyer actually is paying for the home with a combination of what they're putting down as well as what they're getting from their lender. By doing this, it limits what the buyer has to come up with out of pocket, and in many cases allows them to pay more for the home because they realize that the seller is covering the commission for their agent. And when a seller is willing to still cover the commission, obviously this means that in many cases, there's going to be more offers coming in from buyers that can't cover it themselves. Or in some cases, if a seller has no offers at all, at least they'll get an offer from a buyer that does have to pay their agent a commission and is asking for the seller to cover it for them. If that buyer didn't have the extra money to cover the commission and the seller refused to cover it, then that buyer would just walk away and they'd have to go and find another home where the seller is willing to cover it. And so the seller would ultimately lose out. So at the end of the day, the commission really comes out of the transaction no matter who actually pays for it. And what I mean by that is that every seller is going to have in their mind an amount that they want to get after all of the costs of selling, whether or not they cover the buyer's agent commissions or not. And a buyer is also going to have an amount in their head that they're willing to pay minus any commissions or any costs that they have to buy the home as well. As long as those two numbers are aligned between the parties, then they'll come together and they'll obviously have a transaction. So for instance, let's say a seller wants to achieve a sales price of $1 million, not including the commissions they have to pay their agent or their other closing costs. And if a buyer comes along and they're only willing to pay $1 million, including all of their costs, and the seller isn't willing to pay the commission at all, then all a buyer is going to do is say, okay, well, we would be willing to pay $1 million, but since we have to cover our agent's commission, we're just going to have to lower our maximum price to $980,000. And if the seller's not willing to take it, well, too bad, so sad. So you see what I mean? At the end of the day, the commission has to come from one side of the transaction. And of course, traditionally it came from the seller side, because the seller got all of the money in a lump sum payment when they sold their house, and many buyers are struggling to come up with 3.5% or 5% or 10% down, plus whatever other closing costs they have. So a lot of times they don't have an extra 2.5%, 3% to pay an agent to represent them. So what happens if a buyer can't afford to cover any commission for their agent and the seller refuses to pay any commission to the buyer's agent? Well, in that case, then the buyer and the buyer's agent have to walk away from the home and go find another home where a seller is willing to pay the buyer's agent commission. The buyer loses out obviously on that property, but also the seller loses out on a buyer that otherwise would have been interested in buying their home. Now let's go over the process of what it actually looks like paperwork-wise when a buyer decides to hire an agent to represent them. So now with these new laws, a buyer's agent by law has to have a contract in place for any buyers that they work with, and that's generally called a buyer representation agreement. And that needs to be signed as soon as practicable, in many cases before a house is shown, or really as soon as possible, as soon as that relationship gets started. And in a nutshell, this is really just an agreement that kind of outlines the commission to be paid, the term of the agreement, and in California, where I'm from, it's limited to a maximum of 3 months, and also other things like the houses to be covered or the areas that fall under the agreement and so on. Now, the agreement can be for exclusive representation, which means during that period, the buyer's agent is exclusively representing the buyer, or it could be non-exclusive, which in my personal opinion doesn't make sense for me as a professional, because you could see yourself spending months and months and months driving around looking at houses and ultimately have the buyer just use a different agent after you put all that work in. But it is an option, and in some cases I'm sure some agents will be willing to do that for one reason or another. And what the commission part of the agreement really says specifically is that the buyer is going to cover the buyer's agent commission unless the seller covers the commission or a portion of the commission. So if the seller agrees to cover 100% of the buyer's obligation to pay their broker, then the buyer isn't responsible for paying any commission at all. Now, if the seller comes back and they say, hey, we're not willing to pay, say, 2.5%, we'll only pay 2% in commission, well, then in that case, the buyer has to decide whether they're able to or they're willing to cover that additional 0.5% commission. And if they're not, then the options are they can counter back and ask the seller again to pay for it, or they can just walk away because they don't have to accept that counteroffer and then just go look for a different house where they can get that full commission covered by a seller. So the good news is the buyer is never forced to buy the house and pay the buyer's agent commission. It's only if they ask for it from the seller side and the seller says no, they're not willing to cover it, then at that point they have to decide if they're willing to pay it or not. So commission really is just completely negotiable at this point on both the seller side and the buyer side. And it's really only when you actually start writing offers as a buyer that you're going to find out whether or not a seller is going to be willing to cover the commission or not. So it's just another negotiable item. It'll be in the offer to purchase the property, the amount of commission that the buyer's agent or the buyer's broker and the buyer is requesting that the seller cover on their behalf. So overall, in most cases, things are pretty much going to be the same way they've always been. It's obviously going to be in the best interest of many sellers to cover the commission for the buyer's agent, just like they always have. However, there will certainly be more frictions now than there was before. There will certainly be buyers that can't cover the commission or hard-headed sellers that refuse to cover it regardless of the price that the buyer is willing to pay. And so there will be more instances now where buyers and sellers just aren't able to come together, where in the past they would have been based on the rules that existed then. Now, if a buyer can't cover the commission or isn't willing to cover a commission, then what that really means is that they're just going to have to represent themselves in buying a home. This is actually going to be a common outcome that I think happens a lot more than it used to happen under the old rules. And I think this is going to be a recipe for absolute nightmares on both the buyer side and the seller side. And the problem is that neither party is really going to anticipate all the problems that are going to come from this going in. And without going too much into detail, I'll just say that when you represent a seller, if the buyer comes along and they're unrepresented, you are completely handcuffed in what you can do or how you can communicate with that buyer. You can't give them advice, you can't push them along, you can't explain what they need to do, you can't push them to the timelines of the contract. So essentially, all you can do is send them the paperwork and hope and pray that they follow the contract and do the things they're supposed to do within the time frames that they're supposed to do them. And if they don't, there's nothing you can do. And the seller obviously isn't going to like that. So they're going to get angry and upset and think you're doing something wrong, even though you've clearly outlined and explained that you're not representing the buyer and they're coming to the transaction completely unrepresented. So in conclusion, and as I shared at the beginning of this video, I do want to share my thoughts on the matter. And I think this whole new regulation is completely asinine. It's actually going to create far more problems and inequities than ever existed before, in my opinion. Here we are again with the government stepping into our lives, trying to solve one problem and at the same time creating a slew of other problems that both the industry needs to face as well as people that simply want to buy a home and sell a home. It's kind of like the old saying goes, the government breaks your legs and then they give you a set of crutches and talk about how lucky you are that they provided you with a set of crutches. In reality, commissions have always been negotiable. Buyers and sellers have always been capable of making decisions for themselves in what they want to agree to, just like they're able to do in all other parts of their lives. You've always been able to sell a home yourself or buy a home without an agent, so we didn't need the government to get involved at all. But here we are, so I digress. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Leave your comments down below. Let me know how I can help you with your real estate needs, and I appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.